for today's event. I want to especially thank the session organizers. The honors program organized our morning session, so thanks much for that. Our 11:30 session was organized by Professor Madeline Sorrell. It was a wonderful art workshop that we had this morning. Then we had a session, a wonderful session on gender in Americana that was organized by Professor Sporik. I don't know if I see her here right now, which was fantastic, so thank you to her. And then we have Professor Jose Arenas, who's going to speak to us momentarily, which we're very excited about. And then in the evening, if anyone's able to stay or planning to stay, we have a final session at 5 o'clock organized by Professor Anderson in the English department, so a big thank you to her as well. So yeah, I'd like to just ask Madeline to come up and introduce our speaker.
Okay, Jose Arenas is a New York-based artist. He creates work that explores the dual identities, personal, ritual, and migration, and displays the feeling that happens from growing up in two countries. Born in San Jose, California, Arenas spent much of his childhood traveling between Northern California and Guadalajara, Mexico. His experiences navigating two worlds along with its complex process of integration and assimilation informs his work in a variety of ways. Arenas combines decorative patterns, culturally assigned symbols, and familiar abstract forms that create an emotionally resonant narrative that remains open to interpretation. His dense collage approach reflects, among other things, the handmade Mexican street signs found both in Mexico and in many Mexican neighborhoods in the United States. Arenas received his BFA in painting from the San Francisco Art Institute in 1995 and an MFA from UC Davis in California in 2000. His work has been widely exhibited throughout the United States. Cities include San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, and New York City. Recent solo and group exhibitions include Art Palazzi, Hamburg Fine Art in New York in 2015, and City Worker Gallery in New York in 2014, and the Fountain Art Fair in New York and Miami in 2014.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, first of all, to Professor Marie Faden, also to Professor Madeline Sorrell, and everybody else who's here. Welcome. So glad you can be here. I am going to speak a little bit about my work and my own connections to this book. And first of all, I'd like to say there were so many themes that dealt with race, identity, place, migration, love, and alienation. And some of the things that I immediately came up to the surface for me were about placemaking, what I'd like to call placemaking, identity, and that constant evolution of who we are based on place, culture. And for me in particular, my story is traveling back and forth between the United States and Mexico. I was born in San Jose, California, but grew up traveling to Guadalajara, Jalisco. And so that's the starting point that I'd like to share with you. But before I do that, what I wanted to do is just read a little passage that really spoke to me, and it was about the word Americana. This is a group discussion between friends. Janika, who is Efemilu's friend, and there is a discussion in Janika's home. So those of you who might recall this passage, it says a lot, and I wanted to use that as an entry point because there are some things in my own upbringing that relate to that word, that idea of coming back somewhere, and a lot of times even just the idea of finding your place and being in this in-between state. But let me read that. Janika, just make sure you can still talk to us when you come back, Priye said. She'll come back and be a serious Americana, like easy. Ranyundo said, they roared with laughter. At that word, Americana, wreathed in Kali, the fourth syllable extended, and below them who had come back from a short trip to America with odd affectations, pretending she no longer understood Yoruba, adding a slurred R to every English word she spoke. So I thought that was a really telling passage, and again, because when I was thinking about what I would speak about, I was collecting my images, my paintings, and thinking, what are the things that I'm constantly unraveling in my own art practice. It goes back to my experience of being bicultural. As I mentioned, I was born in the States, in San Jose, California, but at a very early age traveled to Mexico and lived there for large periods of time. Throughout elementary and into high school, it would literally be a year in Mexico, coming back and studying here with a different set of friends in each location. Mostly that's because my mother and father were farm workers, and that meant seasonal work, and it also meant traveling from town to town at times. So the very earlier part was about that experience of traveling from not town to town, but country to country. So Guadalajara is in central Mexico, second biggest city in Mexico, and most of my extended family still lives there. My immediate family now is in Northern California, San Francisco Bay Area, but that's, again, what I wanted to use as kind of a stepping stone in a couple of points that I wanted to illustrate as it relates to my own work. So let me start off, I wanted to just talk about a couple of things that I started to unravel in thinking about my own experience. And there were these designated words that I thought about. Americana is, of course, coming back to Nigeria and having a different, almost persona that also I think relates to language. And in Mexico, or actually I should say in the United States, somebody who is of Mexican origin and is born in the States would be Mexican-American, more specifically Chicano or Chicana. And that initially, I think, in the earlier part of the 20th century had a negative connotation to it, but started to move into something that was an empowering identity, particularly in the 60s when civil rights were a main issue, and students began to go out into the streets and say, this is my identity, this is who I am. And of course, there were people who thought of it as this in-between state. Are you Mexican, are you American, what is it? To want to almost kind of set a black and white label. And I think that's where that interesting space began to happen of identifying in this way. So I just wanted to bring that up because, my particular experience, of course, was moving back and forth. And, when I was in Mexico, there's yet another word that I just wanted to bring. I'll come back to that, but I just wanted to show you some of the posters, some of the things that were images that I was exposed to at a very young age that I began to look at and be inspired by, right? These were Chicano power posters. On the right is actually a professor I had many years later by the name of Malaquias Montoya, who did endless amounts of activist-based posters in the 60s, 70s, and currently. So let me actually move into this word also, because I think sometimes, like the word Americana, I was thinking, is that a criticism? Is that something that's seen as a slightly pejorative term, coming back and in some ways forgetting your culture, forgetting your language, evolving into something else? The word POCHO refers to an Americanized Mexican. So many times I was surprised when I went to Mexico, and there was this notion of you're not quite this because there was a very visible accent that said you don't have that perfect Spanish. And POCHO was a term that was thrown around that meant you are anglicized, you are turning into something other than what we know. And you know, at a young age, I mean, you get a term like that, a derogatory term, and you know, all bets are off. But I sort of I think I ultimately internalized that, processed that throughout many years, and now I use a lot of this to charge my work, to inform my ideas in my own art practice. And you'll see a little bit later when I show you some of my images, they deal directly with some of these topics. So one thing that I also wanted to include in this is the idea of language that I mentioned in that Americana passage, where if you have that broken Spanish, you become slightly, or maybe more overtly, the other as well. I found that at a young age I had an accent both in Spanish and English, so that kind of put me in this kind of limbo place. But at the same time, I want to show you some images that relate to placemaking and the evolving identity, I think, at a very young age. When I was in California, many neighborhoods, Mexican, Latino neighborhoods, murals were a really central thing that really, in many ways, told the stories of the people that lived there, history of where you come from, and also how the identity was evolving. So that was something that I was inspired by, that I was exposed by, that I saw were people around me living in the neighborhoods in San Jose, but also in other neighborhoods like San Francisco. And for that matter, if you go to Sunset Park, you'll see kind of essence that exists in these neighborhoods, where it's holding on to certain things, whether it's, and I'll show you in just a bit, you know, the signage that has a particular kind of, or particular approach to it, and sensibility. So let me just go back here. So in Guadalajara, where I lived for many years, some of the muralists that I was exposed to were Jose Clemente Orozco, and this is a painting, a mural actually I should say, of his in Instituto Cabañas in Guadalajara. And it's actually a wall, it's actually on the ceiling, so when you enter into this former hospital, what you have to do is actually lie on low-lying benches and lie on your back to see these works. And at a very young age, my mother, aunt, grandmother took me to these murals. And it was something that told stories. They told stories. And for me, at a very young age, I already knew I liked to draw, liked to paint. And it was something that was a very, very deep point of inspiration, but also so memory-laced. I think that it was also connected to family. That was also something that, again, it was a point of inspiration for me. This is a close-up, and the painting is actually, it's a detail that's called El Hombre de Fuego, the man on fire. And it's a metaphor for social struggle. You also see around these figures that you see all around, they represent the elements, so earth, wind, and water. And you'll see a range of circular murals that are all around that area. Well, you know what? I had a little trouble with my previous images, but I wanted to juxtapose it, and I'll tell you, one of the things that I saw, again, in my neighborhoods in the States were the Chicano movement images. And as I mentioned before, that first idea that it was this in-between, what are you, hybrid kind of identity, again became something that was a point of pride, where young people began to be empowered by this term, and to collectively begin to form their identity in that way. I'm going to move into a constant reinvention of identity. I thought this was a good image to start because I also was thinking to my own inspiration of painters that I identified with. And in this case, in the book, I think there's also that idea of an unfolding identity. Not only a journey in Efemelu's life and the experiences of being other or feeling alienated, I thought that I would include some images of Frida Kahlo. And I think now, as I think to how that really shaped the way that I work in my own practice, it's about symbols. Many symbols that she used were about her own struggle and pain. And of course, if you're not familiar with Frida Kahlo, she painted portrait after portrait of herself. And I'll show you just a couple more. This is her on the left painting a portrait. And you know, one of the things that you begin to see is that you can pull meaning from all of the different things that she chose. Not only the things that she loved that were meaningful and personal to her, but also that underlying pain from her own experience of, at a very young age, being in a bus accident, contracting polio at an even younger age, and the traces of that that followed her throughout her entire life. So if that image is not so clear, on her neck you'll see thorns that are wrapping around her neck and a hummingbird, which has significance. It has, as a symbol, it's something that represents freedom. And as I move into showing you my own work, birds have a very central role in that I use them to also communicate journey. The journey of traveling, of course, back and forth, north to south. So here's a couple more paintings that I wanted to share with you. Now, just one more thing I just wanted to tie in together about living in neighborhoods, in the neighborhood I was in San Jose. Not only was I surrounded by murals, but I wanted to tie in a particular word that's called rasguache. And rasguache comes from, it's originally a term that was, that connotes bad taste, or almost a kind of ghetto connection to it. But I think just like the idea of taking on the identity and saying, I'm Mexican-American, but I'm also Chicano, which is something that is very specific to one's experience growing up in the United States. But rasguache is also a kind of aesthetic sensibility. And you know, scholars, artists have picked it up as something that essentially means making do with what you have, right? Being resourceful and using, you know, many times recycled materials, things that are sometimes seen as as things that you would discard or easily throw away. So I wanted to just show you a couple of examples of that. And also, in my own reflection of my practice in my studio, why am I attracted to certain things? I mean, I am constantly pulling things that have to do with a kind of longing, I think, because I've been in the States for many years. Now there's a kind of mental longing for the things that I began to lose and I feel that I'm losing because I no longer live in Mexico. So my experience of that back and forth is no longer something that fuels and shapes my identity the way it did when I was much younger. So let me just move into this. So a couple of images, I'll give you a little context. This is just the house. It has a whole bunch of tchotchkes. There, you can see this a couple of different ways. Formally, there's a beauty to it. There's repetition. There are elements that repeat and create a kind of pattern. But there's also this kind of obsessive quality of collecting and placing in a kind of aesthetic way, right? And that's something that in my own work, I feel that I have a kind of language that I work from. I have images that are in the form of snippets, printouts, drawings, etc., sitting in my studio that I grab and collect, and I will use at any given time depending on how I am paying attention to certain things that are happening as juxtapositions in my work area. But they're all part of something that continues to evolve, ideas that I'm picking through as well. And so just a couple more things that have to do with this particular sensibility, that crossover, I think. Because when I was very young, lowrider culture was very, very heavy in the early 70s, at least in Northern California. And the bikes were something that overlapped as well. So the lowrider bikes were something that the young kids like us really looked up to. And it was something that we aspired to also do. But one of the things that I think is the kind of interesting overlap is that obsessive, decorative nature of this. And if you look at this, what's the point where it actually doesn't become a functional thing and it's an object of beauty, right? I mean, maybe the bike on the right. But that's something that was something I was exposed to. And later, as I was recollecting and thinking back to things that inspired me, things that were part of my early childhood, I began to research and sometimes incorporating in a very overt manner into my artwork, and other times letting it kind of sit and digest within my workspace to see when the right time would come and I would be able to do that. So I want to enter into these images because I'll segue right into some images that I was directly pulling from. But the street signage that I was talking about earlier really relates to a little history on that. Many times in small towns, you would have somebody in a small village, the one person who would paint all of the signs. And you would have this very direct reflection of the hand. Many of these artists were not trained, and so there was a kind of outsider, naive, call it what you will, quality to them that just makes me crazy. I love this because I photograph and I also am coming to terms with the fact that even though I pull from this, that I've gone through art school, I've drawn plenty, painted plenty, I can't get to that particular approach. So I see it as more, or that particular look, but I see it as more as taking that idea and somehow making it part of my own, and working with the particular language I am working with, and hopefully transforming it into something new. So in this case, the image on the right is it's a little bit more Bay Area specific. Some of you might see SF Giants, Unipass, but I just wanted to show these kind of an entry point so you can see also the way that I began to use text, both as it relates to signaling to language, but also as a formal component. If you look at these, this sign that's painted on a wall, it's really for wrestling. It's a wrestling advertisement. But you also see there's kind of a very specific flair with the way the font is chosen and applied. So there's some very beautiful things that I use again as starting points. Now, the next 3 slides, I just wanted to show you some of my own paintings. I was directly taking some of those ideas of trying to come up with interesting fonts. And in this particular approach, what I was doing was I was constructing and then deconstructing or breaking it down. So with these images, what you'll see is I would paint an area and then cut it and recompose it so that it would be more collage driven. But I also started thinking that I really like that idea of how we also metaphorically think of our identity and how we can continue to excavate and understand how we form our identity. What is it that really makes us who we are? The next couple of paintings, or sets of paintings, also very specifically use Spanish as a language for both moving the viewer around, but also referencing those many different things that I spoke about. In particular, as I said, it's that handmade sign quality that I really respond to. I feel wherever I go that that is something that I feel that when I go to these neighborhoods, I feel like I'm home in some way because it's so familiar as something that I grew up with. One more set of paintings here, as you can see. Again, what I started also doing was bringing in other elements that have to do with religion. The painting on the left were some loose references to First Communion. My upbringing was both Catholic and also a Protestant religion that my parents actually kind of fought over who was going to go to church on Saturday and who was going to go to church on Sunday. So to bring this back also to Americana, I thought it was very interesting the transformation that Fimalu's mother goes through in doing something drastic as cutting her hair and adopting certain things that were part of the religion. And in some ways, I felt that Fimalu goes with that. She's trying to figure out what is really happening with her mom during this particular phase. So I'm going to show you some paintings that have common themes, and I mentioned the birds. The birds take on, for me, a couple of different entry points. One is that, of course, if you think of journey, place, migration, that's definitely something that I insert birds as a way of thinking of these images having symbolic resonance. But also, I think that's also about the opposite of freedom at times. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. I did a couple of paintings that both explored birds in flight so that it would have that sense of full freedom, but also the idea of holding and touching. And in this case, it was a very open-ended thing to have the bird nestled in this hand so that it can keep a kind of open interpretation of whether that means safety or is the bird dead or alive, opens up that kind of conversation. And I like that in my paintings, and that well, first and foremost, that somebody feels something, that there's a resonance there, but also that there are hopefully multiple meanings or multiple levels of meaning that can be also found. So the bird is not just the bird, but I hope that it points to something else. So a couple of other paintings. Que va is actually a standard song in Spanish. So I think also, as I think about how I'm using language, how I'm using certain things that I pull in, it's also holding on to some things that are dear to me. In this case, these were songs that my parents sang. And for that matter, actually, when I say standards, that many people knew and sang together in any kind of gathering space. So again, I think of the language both as retaining that part of me. At this point, I also struggle to pass that on because I have a 9-year-old daughter, and now I'm seeing some of the things that can happen, begin to happen. I speak to her in Spanish, and I see her slowly begin to respond to me in English. And I said at the beginning when I read that passage, it was really interesting because that particular paragraph was talking about language. In that, it was the way that the R would sound, and I struggle with that because I want her to be fully bilingual. At any rate, just a little bit about that, the symbols and the sources for these paintings. The painting on the left was also a very specific thing about language as well. When I was young, my grandmother had canaries, parrots, you name it, she had birds. And so not only a direct memory of my own childhood, but it was also about the idea of a parrot repeating, learning language, And turning it upside down was also the idea of flipping that idea of both languages in Mexico and the United States, but also because I thought of it as this north-south trajectory of traveling north and south back and forth for so long. But I wanted to bring in something that would speak to that. The background, those are various patterns that I've collected and that I put into a kind of tapestry of sorts. And I was thinking also the way that my mom would save little bits of fabric and she would make them into these amazing blankets that sometimes had no kind of, real design, but they were a thing of beauty. They created a kind of pattern and tapestry that was amazing. And so I had little bits of that. I saved them. I used them as specific sources for this as well. One more close-up of this. Pajarito means little bird. And just a couple things that I also started to bring in. If you notice on the bottom, that cut paper, that's a tradition called papel picado, which means you take bits of paper or sheets of paper, fold them, cut them. So it's a long-standing tradition that I grew up with and I began to use in multiple paintings. This one was the one that more prominently showed that, and I wanted to highlight that to bring that in here. Now, just a little bit on swallows. Barn swallows, and in particular swallows in the region of Mexico where my mother grew up, were also a very specific way that I wanted to speak to that. But also what I started to do was to bring in another element, which was a bee. And that was the idea of cross-pollination, of that evolving identity that I started to play with, was something that was, I thought would be an interesting symbol to also explore and juxtapose with other symbols in my paintings. Now, I think we're good with a couple minutes. Okay, so I'm going to just continue with showing you one more set, actually a couple more sets, but I just wanted to show you that the idea of vessels or boats were something that I began to also use. Both as a metaphor and a symbol for that idea of being unmoored, the idea of finding that place. And there are a couple of things that begin to happen, at least with these series of paintings, was that initially I saw it as this empty vessel, or this boat that would have hopefully resonance and meaning. As you see here, what I did was I tried to have a line that would kind of squiggle around and represent maps and places that were part of my childhood memory. So it's almost a cartography of those memories that were used with that central image of a vessel. Eventually, it started to move into a character. They were filled, in other words, with a character that I suppose it's self-referential. It's a self-portrait. Since if everything is a self-portrait, that would be me. But it's that journey, and I think that's one thing that I also take from the book, that there is this idea of journey and returning. Whatever that may be for us, I think it's something that is important to me, that I am continuing to unravel through this practice of making something that's meaningful to myself, and hopefully that others can also find meaning with. Just another image that really has the bee as a kind of central image. Again, I had a few other paintings that had bees that were flipped up and down with the same idea of referencing north and south as a place indicator. With ritual and ceremony, I started also to look at those particular things that brought me together and that had meaning and significance, that were something I could count on. In other words, things that my family did, that both families actually did in Mexico and the United States. Some of it was tied with religion, and so if you look at this, there are parts that I've taken from many different sources. One of the things that I started to pull from and be very interested in was the idea of rascuache, where, again, if we think of First Communion, or another ritual like quinceañera, which is your sweet 15, it would be having this kind of dress, flowers, and some of the patterns I think I started really integrating into this, where I did some portraits that touched on this. And I'll show you another painting here that is actually a snippet of a picture of my mother's first, or sweet 15, quinceañera. And again, what I really like to or respond to in the creation of my paintings is not only to kind of set up a kind of place, but also that these kind of hovering elements, symbols, words, letters at times, that they suggest something, and that together they begin to orchestrate something that hopefully will have a meaning. I'm going to end with these images just so you can see what I've started to do is to use old postcards, both from Mexico and the United States, and integrating them almost as a kind of backdrop. And again, as I just mentioned, using elements and symbols that would almost be a backdrop for all of these different things. I'm still working through that process of when is too much. At times I feel that it's this kind of orchestration that you don't know is going to happen, and that's what, frankly, I think keeps me coming back into the studio, is that I want to follow this through to see what kind of orchestration is going to happen with these symbols, elements, and again, that kind of backdrop, as I mentioned, is literally a specific place. And what I started to think of this as is this little part of something or an experience or memory that you're sending and telegraphing to somebody else and sharing with them that very intimate memory as well, with any kind of note and written part that goes with that image. And frankly, that's actually the next part for me, is exploring what that message might be. At the moment, it's really moving through the way that the symbols in the foreground begin to speak to each other, and they also work together to create an entire unified whole. So this is my last painting. I wanted to just conclude with that, and I wanted to just wanted to say, this book just brought so many things up to the surface that I thought it was amazing, and I hope that you're as inspired by it as I was. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Hi.
Okay, my name is Christina. I'm in Art 69. As I was watching, I actually have more than one question.
Sure.
You was explaining to us about your daughter. You were teaching her Spanish, but she kept responding in English, and you connected that with the book.
Yes.
Which brought to me, it made me think: do you feel that does language create identity?
Does language create identity? I mean, I definitely think that when I was growing up, I got all these different signals. You don't speak Spanish well enough, so learn it. It was initially like, well, okay, I mean, I'm trying, and I'm in this situation where I'm traveling back and forth. And when I mentioned the POCHO term, that's very much about, what are you doing speaking this pidgin Spanish? I mean, you can't speak it. And it was just because of my circumstances. with my family, we have lots of different experiences, and we code switch. In other words, when we're having a family reunion, we will speak English and then jump into Spanish and go back and forth. So I feel it's kind of a fluid thing. It's all integrated. But it is interesting because I do have some siblings who say they're very much against the mixing of both. It's either choose a language and speak it, or don't mix it up. So for example, if you say, oh, I freaked out, but if you say it in Spanish and you say, no te friques, then it's not a word, it doesn't exist. But I think it's fun to mix it up. But I think it's also just knowing. And so with my daughter, my wife speaks Spanish, but she was born here and learned English as a primary language. Later in college, she learned Spanish. And so we make an effort to speak in Spanish, but really day to day. I know that at 2:40, whenever I pick her up, she's speaking, and she has spoken English the entire day. So it's going to be only Spanish with me. And that's kind of the approach I'm taking. Yes.
So, what's the most interesting conversation that has ever been brought up through one of your artworks, whether shown here or not?
Well, one show I had, it was really interesting. I had put a couple of phrases in Spanish, and I had only done I did them very bold against the yellow background, and somebody thought that they were in Hebrew. And so they were sharing their similar experience of growing up in two places, and we had an immediate connection, because I think this is a universal thing. I mean, now that people travel, we're in a global society, that you have very similar experiences of being dislocated or wanting to figure out that where am I? What is place for me, and what is identity? So I thought that was a really interesting thing, because it was in Spanish, that it was in Hebrew, and we had a big, long conversation about that. Gave me ideas for new paintings. Thank you.
Hi. Wonderful talk, beautiful work. I just happened to see this weekend the movie Selena. And her father came from Mexico, and the children were born in Texas. And he had a conversation with children in the bus, and he was saying that in Mexico he wasn't Mexican enough, and when he was in America he wasn't American enough, so he never felt like he was anywhere.
Right.
How you felt going back and forth? Did you believe that when you were in Mexico you were Mexican, and you were American, or did you feel not at home in either place?
Frankly, I felt the other in both places, but I didn't feel, I didn't feel American, and I also didn't fully feel like I was Mexican. But at the same time, my experience, I would say, was for me positive. I thought, when you're a kid traveling 2,000 or 1,800 miles, it was exciting. My mom was scared of flying, so it was Greyhound bus, cross the border and take a train for 25 hours. So it was a journey. But I think from my older brothers, I have a brother who is 64, and his experience was very different. I mean, it was a time when, if you were Mexican, you couldn't marry somebody who was white. So it was a very different experience for them, where they experienced overt racism, lots of, in the playground, it was like, you're Mexican, and it was derogatory terms. So my experience was, I think, very different than theirs. Yes?
Have you been exhibiting your work in Mexico at all, or you talk about shows in New York and in America?
It's funny you say that. There was a place in Mexico City called La Panaderia, and I've been in communication with a friend who is now in San Diego, and they are putting together, or they're talking about putting together a show from Art Institute people, students. I went to the San Francisco Art Institute. There was a gaggle of us from people from Mexico City, from Tijuana, from other parts of South America as well. And we kind of banded together. And recently I've been in contact with a friend who has another mutual friend in Mexico City. And that's something that I'm very excited about to see. No, most of what I've shown is in California. And as Madeline mentioned, Chicago, New York.
When they advertise your shows, do they advertise the shows in Mexican America? Or do they just advertise the show? I'm just curious how,
Yeah.
in the art world, your work is so defined.
Yeah,
Because it has so much Mexican influence,
right.
but it's very universal. You know, geometry, colors, and letters, and all of the different
Right.
Yet there are big influences from Mexico.
Well, as in my bio, it kind of gives that first little punch of my experience of growing up in Mexico and here, and the influences. But as it's a Mexican American, it's interesting. I've had conversations with other artists, fellow artists who are either Central American, Mexican American, and there's a kind of split, I think. Some people say, I don't want to be labeled as such, and so that could kind of pigeonhole me into a particular genre or a type of work. And at the same time, is it something like you said that acknowledges these roots and these traces of my own upbringing? I guess I would consider that. I'm not sure. I identify with all of those things, but I guess I haven't really put them, inserted them, and framed them in such a way. Right.
I have a question about your process. The canvases look almost like collage, like really whether you're pencil sketchers or how many questions.
So the question is, in my process, how do I develop the paintings because they look very collage-like? Just in the last 6 months, I've been. It's changing a little bit. Sometimes what I do is I will make a drawing, make a little painting as a study, and then I'll break it apart in Photoshop, and then I'll reconfigure it and see it 5 different ways. And even beyond all of that process, I find that when I actually begin painting, I kind of feel bored with it already. So it's more that what I described as coming in and seeing what's going to happen, like this problem that I'm solving. I mean, it's really more than that, but just that it's this exciting thing that I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm there and I'm invested so that I can, get to that other end. Now, that said, I do have a plan, and many times I also use kind of the old school, transparencies where you have an overhead, and I'll do a Sharpie drawing of a bird, and I'll project it, and I'll pull back, see it 5 different sizes, and then I just say, okay, let's go with that. And I draw it with a white China marker because I can draw on top of an oil layer, and then once I do that, I begin painting, and I go layer by layer. The collage ones were really more cutting with a cutter, paper cutter, and then just kind of reconfiguring to see what felt right as a composition. That's kind of what I just described. That's just kind of what I've lived for. I mean, I'm already thinking, what am I going to do this evening? Well, I can't go to the studio tonight. But any other questions? Hi.
Going to the book, in your experience, did you find there were times when you tried to disengage from being Mexican or being American? Were there times when you tried to push one of those identities away?
I guess I would say early on when I was in elementary school, there was in California, there was a pressure at times to want to belong. In other words, be like the other kids. And one thing I didn't mention was, when I was in elementary in San Jose, there were a lot of Latino kids. So they were just like, I saw myself. But my mom pulled me out of, couple of years, she pulled me out and put me in a small religious school, and I had to travel to literally the other side of town. And there were no Mexican kids, there were no black kids, and it was very apparent that I stuck out. And I guess those were the times that, that as you know, when you're very young, you're trying to figure this out, and I felt very self-conscious. Hi.
You said something that was really important just now. I don't mean to draw the conversation into race, but I want you to elaborate on what you just said. You mentioned how your mom took you from one school and placed you in the other. The first school you were comfortable, the other you weren't, not only because of the distance of the school, but because there were no Mexicans like you and no blacks. Do you feel like, I want to worry what I'm saying correctly so we don't get lost in
Sure.
it. Do you feel that you, as a Mexican, share the same difference as a black, as far as do you go through the same isolation as them, or if you did find a black person, would you feel comfortable in that school, at least finding one? You understand what I mean?
Sure. And maybe bringing it back to the book, I mean, I felt...
No, we're talking about your experience.
No, I know, but I'm saying more in reading, I felt the way Ephemeral felt at times. So I could relate to some things that I connected to in my own life. That particular experience of growing up, or of attending that school, and I should elaborate more on that. That was my initial, response. But ultimately, the kids were very warm, and I made friends. But it was something that I noticed. It was something that I took note of, that I stood out as being different.
That's how I was asking you, that same difference. Do you feel like you experienced black people? For you to mention that, it means something.
That I experienced it as being the other, as being.
And maybe I'm not explaining myself there. What I meant was, you were in one school, and you noticed yourself that they were not, no Mexicans there at your school. And then you mentioned there were no black ones.
Right.
Would it have made a difference to you to have found a piece of Mexican or black? It doesn't matter. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you guys share a
yeah,
difference?
absolutely. I think I felt that was the diverse range of kids that I again saw myself in relation to when I was in that public school, and just a little bit more on that. Actually, it was much more diverse too, because there was also a big Hmong community as well. That was part of that school. I guess the only thing I was saying was that I felt like I was just a little bit alone in that
What I
way.
was aiming for is, did you feel, remember that term you used called POCHO, I think, POCHO?
POCHO,
POCHO.
yes.
Do you feel like if you had found people who were more like POCHO, like, would you feel more comfortable? Because, what POCHO stands for as being,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? It's like it's a derogatory word that you did mention, but you said that POCHO also means that you come from a middle class family. So if you found people who were POCHO-like,
No, I don't come from a middle class family.
no, I'm saying that.
Oh.
That's what the word means.
Right.
So if you found an environment that made you feel like
I thought of that because I think one thing, and I don't remember if I mentioned it, was that term also became something that was taken and used also as a point of pride, saying, yeah, I'm POCHO, whatever, this is who I am. This is beyond me. I mean, this is where I grew up. So, yes, I would say so. Absolutely. I mean, I felt like I kind of moved back and forth and fluidly adapted. As I was saying, it was more of a positive experience for me, and for my older brothers, in some ways, it was something that they don't look back so fondly on. So we all, when we sit at the table, we discuss all of these different things. And by the way, I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters, and we all would not agree on these terms, saying, I'm not POCHO, or I'm not, Chicano. and because I also have brothers who were born in Mexico, and most of their early childhood was actually in Mexico. So we all have just a diversity of experiences. I think what it does is actually just bring beautiful dialogue on the table. Thank you.
One more minute.
Hello everyone. I was scheduled to, what was that, 3 o'clock I was supposed to give remarks? But we have a visitor here from a commission that evaluates our college. We have to do that every 10 years to make sure that we are doing a good job for you. So at 3 o'clock, all of the senior staff had to meet with her, and she began her remarks by saying that she had lunch with our students, and that they love the college, and she adored our students, because our students were saying specifically what they are doing on this campus that they love. KCC Reed was one of them that they mentioned. So all these co-curricular enrichment activities that we have, publishing in distinctions, going to Salzburg, Echo Festival, all of these things were mentioned to her, and she was so pleased that not only we have excellence in the classroom, but we also do our best in a rich menu of activities for our students to better connect and engagement. So everyone was looking at me when she was making this comment, because we are really responsible for doing that. So I want to thank Professor Jose Arano. I'm sorry that I wasn't here to hear your wonderful speech. I want to thank everybody who is here, including our good faculty. We have raised the bar for you. We give you a book in the beginning of the year. We ask you to engage it, to really deeply reflect on it, and relate to it. And every time I come to a roundtable or to a conference like this, I'm amazed. All of you are high potentials, high performance. We just have to provide you those opportunities for you to shine. So thank you. And thank you. Special thanks to our board members.